All right, would anyone like to share their top 2 values? Is it too personal?
Faith and family.
Faith and family. Okay, would you guys agree? Okay, you probably see that in Pastor Alex. Faith and family. Anyone else? Paulo?
Faith and honesty.
Faith and honesty. This is a much holier service than mourning. Nobody said faith. Okay, great. Anyone else? Faith and honesty. Faith and honesty. Connection. Okay, what else?
Faith and wisdom.
Faith and wisdom. I should have taken out faith. Yeah, faith and wisdom. Okay, awesome. Any last chance? Last chance. And fitness. All right, so I want us to notice, besides the commonality of faith, it's all very different. Right? People are going to come to very different conclusions of what on that list matters to them. Whenever I go through this exercise, I tend to land on things that have to do with balance and things that have to do with efficiency. And so if you know me, I'm a fairly calculated person. I'm not very caring sometimes because caring is inefficient. And I value balance. Those are the things that drive me. And the reason why I think it's important is this. The problem that Paul is facing when writing to the church in Corinth is one of values. Our values are at the heart of what causes our actions, if you think about it. Our values is what drives our decision making oftentimes. Our values help us form our opinion about other people or about the world. Right? And because we all have different values, and it's not necessarily that one is right or one is wrong, that's often when conflict occurs. Not because that person is wrong and you are right. The conflict occurs when their value system is opposite of yours or comes into some sort of conflict with your value system. And everyone in this room was sort of different for the most part, is what I'm guessing. And so that's exactly what Paul is dealing with. He's dealing with a value system that is conflicting with what he feels they should value. And it's important for us to be aware of these things because if we actually realize what it is that drives us, sometimes our decision making becomes a lot more clear. And we don't have to wonder, why did we act that way? We don't have to wonder, why does someone make these choices? Well, they make the choices because they value family, or they make the choices because they value faith. But I also think that it's important to look at these every now and then and really evaluate them and ask ourselves, yes, these are the things that matter to me, but are they things that should matter to me? Are there things that supersede these top 2, so to say? Right? And the church that Paul is dealing with it's a church that values the show over the substance. They value the delivery of a message over the content of a message. We saw last week that they must have valued ethnicity, that they really cared about where you came from and what your lineage was. This week we'll see that this church values mystical experiences, that for whatever reason for them, that's something that they consider very important. And so the church has been criticizing Paul, saying, Paul, you're not as exciting as these other teachers. You're not as well-spoken. And Paul's answer is quite surprising. He says, you're right. I'm not as well-spoken. I'm not as exciting. But what that should show you is that Christ is working very clearly in my life because it's not me. It's clearly him. And so he's going to turn their value system upside down. They value power and strength. He's going to boast instead about his weakness and his shortcomings. So it's important as we read this that the way Paul is writing, he described last week as he's playing the fool. He's writing a very calculated rant of a person pretending to be a little crazy. And if we don't read that with that in mind, it's very easy to misinterpret what he's really saying. Okay, so with that, let's take a look at our passage, which I'm going to start in verse 30. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness, that the God and Father of the Lord Jesus, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. Why does Paul bring up the idea of a basket? Well, back then, in order for cities to be protected, they often formed a wall. There was a wall around most major cities. And so when the Roman army was attacking a city, they would come up against this wall. And there was an honor given to the soldier who was brave enough and strong enough to be the first one to climb to the top of that city's defensive wall. And provided they survived the battle, that Roman soldier was highly honored, and they were given what was called a wall crown that was made of gold. And so in this society, they clearly know that there are soldiers that are being honored for their achievement of climbing up a wall. They are made to look great because they ascended. But what Paul is saying is, you know what I did? I didn't climb up a wall. I was lowered down a wall in a basket. And the point he's making is this: my life, there is nothing I can boast about. That experience is not considered something to be desired or honored. That experience is actually very embarrassing. And so he's continuing to do what he did last week, which is boast not about how great he is, but he's boasting about how weak he is so that Christ would be more magnified. And what he's constantly having to do with the church is he's pointing their vision in the right direction. Because oftentimes their value system is saying, look here. Their value system is saying, this is important. This is what you should worry about. These are the things that we should esteem. And their value system is pointing them away from Christ. And Paul's saying, no, don't look there. Don't look at people. Don't look at talent. Look at Christ. And that happens to us, right? Our value systems, although they're good, whether we know it or not, sometimes point us in the wrong direction. And instead of seeing Christ, and instead of valuing the things that he would value at that moment, maybe I tend to value efficiency, or I tend to value balance, or I tend to value these other things, right? And so we're constantly having to reevaluate and redirect our attention in the right direction, whereas it may be pulled subtly in the wrong direction by the things we value. So then he goes on in chapter 12, verse 1. I must go on boasting. Though there is nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Remember, he's ranting, but he's pretending to be a fool here. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may never utter. On behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weakness. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So Paul starts out this passage saying, I know this guy who is caught up in the third heaven. But then later on, it's very clear he's talking about himself. So why does he do that, right? That's a very common Jewish practice. When you're about to share a mystical vision, you talk about the encounter as if it's happening to somebody else. But he talks about this thing called the third heaven. And I don't have to guess, but I'm pretty sure as you encountered this in community group, there was probably some question of what is the third heaven, right? The third heaven is a very consistent way that the Jewish culture tried to break down reality. There are some hints that some people thought there were 7 heavens. Some people thought there were 10 heavens. But let's take a look at this construct of the third heaven. Here's one way to understand it. This is just one way. The first heaven in Jewish understanding typically refers to the realm that we can see and experience. So they would refer to that as the reality that we can sort of touch and feel and sense. So when you look up at the sky, you can see that. It's clear. That would be what Jewish people would say the first heaven. The second heaven tends to refer more to the spiritual realm, where there's this warfare going on between angels and demons. And it's a realm that we can't always sense. It's a realm that's not evident to us. You see a lot of passages in the Bible that refer to this constant spiritual warfare going on in a way that we can't always perceive. Now, the third heaven is what we would refer to as heaven. Paul calls it paradise, which is actually borrowed from a Persian term. But think about it this way. In the Jewish culture, the number 3 was the number of completion. So what Paul is saying when he was caught up to the third heaven is that I was caught up to the best heaven, the place where God is, the place where God reigns. So he's caught up to where God is, what we would refer to as heaven. So why? Why does he bring this up? Okay. Apparently, the church was very impressed with these sort of things. They grew up in pagan religions that valued these mystical experiences. And so what Paul needs to do is he needs to kind of bring this into the conversation. And what we're going to see is that he's boasting, but he's not really boasting. He has to show that he is equal to these super apostles who claim to have experienced all these great visions, but at the same time, he also has to downplay their significance in evaluating whether or not he is authoritative as a leader. And he basically says, I was caught up in this vision. He doesn't say he earned it. He doesn't say that he prayed so hard that God had no choice but to bring him up to heaven. I was caught up. It was not me or anything like that. And he doesn't go on to tell anything about it. It's interesting because how many of us know people that have written books about going to heaven and coming back? I don't know their validity, but according to this, there's things that people should not utter, right? So you kind of be the judge of that. But Paul doesn't tell them anything about it. Part of the reason I think is Paul realizes it's not helpful. If I told you that I went to heaven and I described what it looked like, I don't think that would be helpful to the community. Yes, it's important to Paul. Yes, it's highly personal. It's probably a huge part of his life. But in the end, it's not going to help the community. And so he says, don't look at this. Don't worry so much about visions and dreams and prophecy. There's churches on the extreme end that their worship service is very centered on these sort of experiences. Paul's saying, don't value that. That's not what's important. You're looking the wrong way again when you think that that sort of thing is important. Instead, look this way. And then he tells them from his point of view what is important. Look at verse 6. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. In other words, he's saying, this really happened to me, but I refrain from it so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So what is he saying? Don't judge me based on whether or not I've had visions, or whether or not I've seen and experienced powerful things. Don't judge me on that. Those are not the things that matter. If you're going to judge me based on my ministry in you. Judge me based on the fruit that you see. Right? It's not these big events in our Christian life that should define our spirituality. What should define our spirituality is daily faithfulness. And we all have these benchmark events that are important. Our baptism, the times where we first encountered Jesus and surrendered to him. But those are not the things that we should use to necessarily evaluate our spirituality, our life. It should be the daily faithfulness. Don't rely on that mission trip you went on 5 years ago, or that big offering you gave, or that time when you shared a testimony and everyone in the congregation was touched and repented. And those are important, but what Paul is saying is what it really matters is what comes out of me on a daily basis, my daily faithfulness, the daily kindness we show people, the daily forgiveness we give to people when it's hard to forgive, the daily way that we allow Christ to flow out of our lives. That's what we should value, not whether or not someone's seen a vision. And then he goes on. Are we okay? Yep. It's only 6 pages today, okay? It's usually 8. 2 Corinthians, right? Here he goes on in verse 7. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So Paul doesn't really go into detail about what this thorn is. And there's a lot of theories out there. There are people that sort of go more the safe route, and they think it's some sort of physical situation. They think that the thorn refers to the fact that Paul is short in stature. Some think it has to do with the fact that maybe Paul had bad eyesight. Others would think that he had some sickness or debilitating disease that was following him around his whole life. And, all those things are consistent because here's what he says. It's a thorn in the what? Flesh, right? It's a fleshly issue. It's not necessarily a spiritual issue. It's a fleshly issue. It's also consistent from a systematic theology standpoint of what we know about Paul. That, probably he was short. Probably he did have bad eyesight. Others think that it was something more psychological, like maybe Paul was always given to depression or anxiety. And we read in his letters he seems anxious a lot. Some think it has to do with adversaries and persecutions, which is why he writes about insults and hardships and persecutions. But the fact is this, Paul doesn't give specifics because the Corinthian church probably knows exactly what he's talking about. To them, it is really obvious what Paul is referring to when he's talking about this thorn in the flesh. But at the same time, you and I will never, ever know, for sure, until we get to the third heaven. But if you only make it to the second heaven, good luck, okay? We'll relay the message for those that make it. Anyway, so we don't know what it is, but what do we know? There are some things that we can still glean from this. Here's the first thing I want us to see. The thorn was given to him purposely. It was given, is what he says. There is a thorn that was given. It was purposeful. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't that he was a victim of bad circumstances. The thorn had a purpose in his life. Okay? Just think about that. That word for thorn is actually better translated as a stake. It is this pointy object that is meant to, to cause pain and impale something. Right? It's a stake. So instead of picturing this thorn, which is kind of annoying, picture a stake, okay? Like a very sharp, pointy object, right? And the tense of the verse is present tense, meaning what? This painful thing is always occurring. There are times where maybe it feels like it's getting better. There are times where it sort of fades into the background, but it's always there, and it's always coming back. And just when I think it's gone, it's still there. Not a very pleasant thing to think about, right? Last night, this is really random, sort of unrelated, but last night my daughter came into the room pretty late at night. Sometimes she'll sleep in her room, sometimes she'll come to our room. When she comes in our room, she moves around like a maniac, right? And so she'll end up sideways, upside down, she's all over the place. And often what happens is she jabs her foot into my side. Right, and or touches my face, or I couldn't sleep, right? And the whole time, I was like, I got to preach a message, and I'm going to be very tired and might not make any sense. And I was thinking, God, this is dumb, right? But is this the thorn in my side? Her foot jabbing literally into my kidney? Is the fact that this is going to keep me awake all night going to show somehow your power? I don't know. But the point is, Paul is dealing with this persistently. And it gets worse because the phrasing there is, this is a messenger of Satan sent to harass him. That word harass is the same word used when describing the sufferings of Jesus. And so what Paul is saying is there's this thing that's opposing me, and it's humiliating me in a violent way, comparable to how Jesus was humiliated before he went on the cross. So not only is this thing poking me and impaling me all the time and causing me pain and discomfort, it's actually slapping me around and humiliating me. And this is always, always there. And what we probably think is, in Paul's point of view, his life would be better without it. And so he probably thought that it interfered with his ministry, and he asked God 3 times to remove it. And guess what God said? He said no. Think about this. You're Paul. Your whole life has been devoted to serving God. Your prayers probably center around the churches. And then you come to God and God, I just have this one selfish request. Just one time, God. I know I usually pray for churches. I usually pray for all these other things. But just one time, could you remove this issue? And God says no. After all you've done, right? After how much you serve him, God says no. And then maybe you come back a second time and you say, okay, God, maybe the timing wasn't right. Everything's in your timing. Maybe you didn't want to heal me just yet. But God, come on, this time. I've still been faithful, even though that's there. Even though it's hindered me, I've still been faithful. I've done everything I could. Second time, God says no. Paul comes back in prayer and probably, third time, right? 3 is the number of completion. God must listen to me now. Third time, Paul begs God, please remove this thorn, this stake in my life. And God still says no. Think about that. Why? Because it was given. It was purposeful. And Paul makes it very clear what the purpose of the thorn is in his side. He's very clear that the thorn helps him know and helps us know that he is completely incapable of doing ministry out of his own strength. That he and us are completely incapable of doing anything for God out of our own strength. We are inadequate, and the thorn is this constant reminder of that. The thorn, the weaknesses, the trials we go through, the pain that we go through, really gives us a clear picture of this one truth. And this one truth is not hard, but it's hard to live out. It's that you and I need God. Think about the rebellion. What was at the heart of the rebellion? The heart of the rebellion was you and I said, God, we don't need you. And we said, God, I got this. I am wise enough and I am strong enough to do this life on my own. I got this, God. And we always come back to this time and time and time again. And as much as we get closer to God, sometimes our attention, our value systems point us to saying, I got this, God. And what we need at that moment, as much as I hate to admit it, what I need at that moment is a thorn to slap me around and say, wake up, you idiot. You need God. Because see, you and I, we learn more about God's grace and love and power when he helps us to endure than when he helps us to escape. I'm going to say that again, and because of the phrasing, we're going to say amen, okay? We learn more about God's strength and power and grace and love in our lives when he helps us to endure than when he helps us to escape. You and I will experience the most power not when we are strongest. We are going to experience the most power when we come to a place where we are so reliant on his strength alone. Now listen, we all have things that we probably pray for God to take away. We all have things and situations that we feel if they were not there, life would be better. And we might be better ministers for God. For some of us, it's physical illnesses or chronic diseases that we've just struggled with and we've prayed. And God doesn't seem to take that away. For some of us, there's mental issues we consistently struggle with, whether it's depression or just self-hatred or these sort of things that we always comes back. And even when it fades, it's always there. Some of us maybe have past regrets that we can't seem to let go of. And it would be really great if I could just forget all the dumb things I've done in the past. Some of us have habits that we can't seem to get over, and no matter how hard we try, we fail time and time again. Some of us, there's just people in our lives that make it difficult, and we pray, if God could just make those people go away, then things would be so much better. And don't get me wrong, these are things we should pray about and things we should seek God for. But at the same time, here's what I want us to think about. That those weaknesses, those experiences, those painful, traumatic things that occur in our life, they're not there to crush us only. They're not meant to destroy us. They are not meant to limit us. They are not meant to close doors that, because I have this going on, I can't progress to this level. Because I have this situation, I can only get this far. They're not meant to limit or crush us. That those things in our lives that we view as thorns to be taken out sometimes are opportunities for the Father to show his power to us and through us. And unfortunately, there are situations that are inescapable. They're going to be with us for a lifetime. And we can pray and we can pray. And I believe that God is a God of miracles, and I believe God can make certain things go away, but I also know some things are inescapable. Could we just remember that God is sometimes speaking through those things? That Christ becomes more clear to us and more clear to the world as he works in our weakness. And you know, to be honest, when God says no, it sucks. It sucks. It's painful. And you know and I know that it's one of those things that you just can't understand at the moment, that doesn't make sense to us at the moment. But we know that it's going to be much clearer in hindsight. You know, like sometimes when you go hiking up a mountain, you don't understand why this is the path they chose. Why do I have to climb over rocks? Why couldn't I go this way? And when you get to the mountaintop and you look back, it becomes so clear why that's the path you had to take. And I think with these sort of things, oftentimes, we know that God is going to use this. We know that God is bringing us to a place where we can depend on him, but it still sucks. And it still might not make sense. But here's what I just want to leave us with is sometimes what we gain from that no, what we gain from enduring through hardships is a lot more valuable than what we gain if God were to say yes. And I want to close with this verse that has just been, I keep coming back to this. Every morning as I read the word, I keep coming back to this verse in Habakkuk chapter 2. Here's what it says. This is the New Living Translation. I usually don't like that because it's not literal, but I like the way it phrased it this time. For as the waters fill the sea, the earth will be filled with, I love this word, with an awareness of the glory of the Lord. See, here's what I think. I think the glory of the Lord is all around us. We are in an ocean of God's glory. Creation screams of his glory. The salvation we see, the changed life, all of that screams with God's glory. We're swimming in it. But you know what we lack sometimes? Awareness of it. And for whatever reason, brokenness, pain, heartache, dependence makes us a lot more tuned in to God's goodness and glory in our lives. Whereas sometimes our value systems blind us from it. Whereas sometimes our comfort blind us from it. We see time and time again in the Bible, there's something about coming to a place of complete desperation and trust and need where we are just so aware. We are so tuned in to the ocean we're swimming in of the glory of God. Can we close our eyes? And I'm going to ask the music team to lead us in a few songs as we reflect on the word a bit. And I realize there are people in this room that you have been praying for years for the same thing, and God seems to say no. And that doesn't mean you stop praying for it. It's just that maybe we sort of understand that as an opportunity for us to be more aware of his glory. There are maybe others in this room who, as we identified your values, maybe as we dug into it, that maybe it's time to reevaluate. Not that it's bad, but maybe God would ask you to think about whether or not sometimes we elevate those things above him. Again, not that they're bad, but that they become the driving force in our lives as opposed to him. And so in whatever way we need to wrestle with the word, we'll leave the space in the next 5 to 10 minutes.